Hi, everybody. Welcome back to an episode of the Precursive Perspective with me, Jonathan Corrie. For those of you watching, you'll notice I'm in a different room as we've just recently got a new office in central London. I'm delighted today to be joined by Michelle from Cleverbridge. How are you? It's lovely to see you.
Good. Great to be here, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
And you've just come back off PTO, so first week back.
Yeah,
Hopefully you had a lovely holiday.
got a little bit of a tan, was
Yeah,
responsible with the sunscreen and a few drinks in my hand. So I'm settling back into work this week for sure, but good to be here.
very good, very good. We'll give our listeners a little bit of a little bit of a background to you, kind of a little bit about your background and the current role and that sort of thing. That would be great.
Sure, yeah. So right now I'm at Cleverbridge. They're a German company with a large US component, and I'm the VP of Professional Services. So I look after all of their client delivery. So lots of things going on there as they're a heavily growing company. And what they really focus on is growth automation for particularly SaaS companies. So we have an e-commerce element, but we integrate a lot with marketing systems that do digital campaigns as well as CRMs like Salesforce to really automate that renewals process. So there's not a heavy human component in focusing on renewals and really making it more of a self-service activity. So super exciting. I've only been here for a little over a year. I started in January of 2023, and it's been a journey getting here. So I started my career at Deloitte Consulting. And
Hmm.
then after, 4 or 5 years, I realized being on the road Monday through Thursday, Monday through Friday, Sunday through Friday,
There you
pretty
go.
soon you don't know where you live. And I thought, well, I really would like to take a step out of the true consulting. And I was working particularly in systems integrations associated with mergers and acquisitions. So I thought I really like to work in that hustle and bustle world. And I particularly found a niche that I like in PE-backed SaaS companies. So I've bounced around a little bit, usually every 3 or 4 years, sometimes even shorter. I like to learn something new. So I've been with a few companies through moments of acquiring other companies and growing. I worked in EMEA, growing a team in a new region. That was an interesting component for one of the companies I worked at called IQ Navigator. And right before Cleverbridge, I actually worked in fashion technology. I'm
Yeah,
not
you told me.
a fashionable person, but I worked at a company called Gerber, and they do software for pattern development, PLM systems. They also have automated cutters that, any fashion manufacturer designer would certainly know, and a lot of schools educate folks in. So I found it to be really exciting. They were in a moment of growth and PE backed. And I knew when I joined, okay, we need to really transform the business and focus on how are we going to change professional services, mature the organization, focus on strategy. So I think that's where I get really interested in new roles because that element of transformation is just so important and so interesting. You need to be really cautious about how you do that. And certainly when you're moving at speed. And so now at Cleverbridge, we are also PE backed and, we're in a moment of high growth, which is super exciting. And PS has recently gone through a large transformation, both organizationally last year and then from a strategic level. So it's an exciting place to be.
Awesome. Well, I love that mix of background. I mean, I think the starting in consulting stands you in good stead for a number of reasons throughout your career, right? The diversity of clients. I think consulting companies would have baked into you some of the thinking around fiscal responsibility and margin and these types of things, which can stand you in good stead in a PE-backed
Yeah.
software company. Because I think that can take some folks by surprise, right? If you've operated in VC-backed companies, and it's less so now with growth at all costs being a little bit less fashionable and much more focused on profitable growth. But that I would imagine it stood you in good stead. So excited to get you on and kind of linking to that last bit that you talked about there in terms of the strategic transformation. Just starting this really kind of at the top with strategy. I think services is one of those functions where the context of services can really be slightly different depending on what you're selling, the software category you operate in, the board's view of services, all of these different dynamics. So
Yeah.
I'm curious from your perspective, kind of what is your experience about how that company context and circumstances can have an outsized impact on your PS strategy?
Yeah, it's been interesting, some of the targets have changed from company to company, and sometimes, especially as I look at new companies, I don't particularly focus on the number because sometimes somebody could say, okay, you're going to be, working in an organization where you have a $40 million PS profitability line item, but it's very easy to achieve because the foundation has already been there. Certainly in Deloitte and some of these places, they're used to this. But then as I moved into SaaS companies, particularly at Cleverbridge, what I found interesting is, and they were very upfront with it, is they did not particularly sell professional services before. This was a new line item for them. So top line growth is, I don't have a particularly high revenue goal, but it is harder to achieve than some of the much higher revenue goals that I've had in the past. So I think the context is really total customer value over their lifetime, right? So in that customer lifetime value that we look at now, it's enabling ARR rather than focusing on the, one-time invoice you might get from professional services. And so I really value organizations that are looking to partner with clients rather than, hey, we just want to sell you a service. Looking back, my time at Deloitte feels like so long ago, but it was very much, we're going to bring you high value, but it's also high cost services. And it was all about running at, 30, 40, sometimes even higher profit margin percentages. So it's interesting moving into a world where our margins are maybe not what's under scrutiny. Certainly, we want to look at that, but we want to say, okay, that we're bringing on a client that in their total lifetime with our software company could be a much higher value. So is it worth, putting this giant invoice in front of them for that package? Certainly, giving away free services has other barriers, right? Customer engagement and getting clients to come
Yep.
to calls and actually kick off that project is always going to be really hard, as we all know at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been interesting seeing that evolution and developing tools internally where we can better look at what is the total value and what's the investment and how can we become more smart about repeatable processes, maturing our own internal PS strategy to maybe minimize our cost to onboard a client, but set them up for success and then just don't disappear, right? So my team's always working really closely with our client success management team, both at Cleverbridge and my former company, Gerber, purchased by Lecter ultimately. But we work really closely together so that we provide that strategic partnership. And I've seen that evolution, particularly in the last like 5 or 6 years in professional services and talking to people out in the industry, that we're not just here to go out and provide a package. An implementation package is, of course, something you need and you want things to be repeatable, but you want to pick up on other things during that project and have people on your team that could maybe listen a little bit more to clients and say, hey, oh, are there other challenges you have in your organization? Like, here's a best practice process that we're going to coach you to,
Yep.
but there's other features available in the tool that maybe you aren't even familiar with. How can I open the door to help you adopt those? And so I feel that PS is really shifting in that way, and certainly at Cleverbridge.
Yeah, I think a lot of people underappreciate the importance of like repeating a message. It's very easy for things to be forgotten. If you
Yeah.
think about like if you're depending on the complexity of software you're implementing, you've got a 3, 6, 9 month engagement. We've got a project at the moment which is going to take a year, right? It's hugely complex. Like it's a very large transformation. And like there's things that are going to get missed or forgotten or need to be re-emphasized throughout that journey. And I think this idea that it's not just a project, it's customer engagement, right? And it's the
Yeah.
first part of the engagement is so important. How important is it to know the context that you're in? You and I have spoken before about being kind of really explicit with the exec team or the board about, like, what do you really want of us? Are we an ARR enabler? Am I giving you
Yeah.
that 40% margin? If it's, I can give you 35% margin, but I can drive more ARR up by X, but I've got to give away some services. Are we okay with that? Like, how important is it to be kind of very explicit and nail down that, like, what are we for?
Super important because you need to outline what's going to be achievable and really learn. When I came into Clever Bridge, I was handed some goals that had been pre-decided,
Right.
which is typical, right? You're going to go into any company like that. And I find that very interesting because, it wasn't become a profit center for the company. It was about driving ARR. We're certainly out there not trying to nickel and dime our clients. There are a ton of things that we're not charging for because ultimately it's good in partnership, it's good for adoption, it's good for the ongoing customer lifetime value. But I've been at prior organizations where, hey, it's about covering the cost of your department.
Yep.
And particularly in my prior company, it was interesting because the PE firm said, "Hey, Michelle, what do you think we could do?" Because I came in and they asked me, and I looked at, learning a lot about our clients, what they're paying for. And we had two elements in our organization. We had packages and we had strategic projects that are more
Yep.
about partnership and more driving lifetime value. So we took a two-pronged approach and we said, hey, this element of packages and just doing repeatable trainings and really just as a package, we could make that profitable. But this
Mm.
side of professional services is going to be slightly less profitable because it's not actually going to be focused fully on the invoices that I drive, but more on the ongoing relationship and value of the total lifetime of that client. So it was interesting to have that two-pronged approach and presenting that back to the PE at the time. I think they were really open and supportive and also challenging and saying, hey, we want to push that forward. Okay, your goal's here. We want to see something 25% higher. But in the end, you need to pick something achievable and you need to hold your line with what you're learning about the organization. You have to build models off of the pipeline that sales is going to achieve and what's your expansion and upsell pipeline look like and how does that drive these two levers within your organization. And we had a pretty complex model we developed. It wasn't perfect, right? We evolved it every year, but ultimately by giving the PE and the board the view into that model, we were able to show, hey, this is what we're able to achieve and we actually have a path towards. Of course they're going to say, what's the stretch goal? Can we see what if we do better here, worse there, and there were different levers that we could pull, but we spent a lot of time getting into detail. And I was fortunate enough to have a supportive PE firm that we worked with there that
Mm.
listened, pushed us like they
Yep.
should.
Yep.
Ultimately, the company did sell to our largest competitor, which is a huge success. And we
Mm-hmm.
were really happy about that. So it was exciting to see some of that come to fruition. I felt there was also this internal change management. Particularly at that company, I had very tenured team members, and some of them had never been billable before, or some of them had always been billable but didn't work on these strategic projects. So the levers of, internal KPI and operational management really had to change, and there was a lot of change for the team. Their job was measured in a different way, and they might have been there for 2 decades. And they said, "This
Right.
is what I've done, and every past year, this is the metric I was measured on. What is this new thing?" So I think
Yep.
there was both a large internal change element that we had to
Yep.
go through in transformation, and then, of course, managing the communication with the board and being really reasonable. I'm a big proponent of if I honestly do not think that I have a good run at that goal, and of course, professional services is always dependent on sales pipeline, upsell, expansion pipeline from the CS team. if we don't have a good run at that goal because we don't have pipeline or opportunities to support it, we need to flag that soon, early, often, and make sure that the PE is aware of that. Because while we might not be a huge profit line anymore, like in past PS true,
Yeah.
consulting worlds, it's a huge component.
Well, you're soon a red line very quickly, right, for them, and
Yeah. Yeah.
it's noticeable. There's a number of things in there that I just want to pick up on and respond to, which I think are really interesting. One, you say that like the targets have been set. I think one of the things that is you know, that I see services leaders being much more conscious of now is kind of what am I getting myself into? They're very hyper aware in that interview process when you're approaching a business of like, what is the context? Like, what are the targets? How have they been set? When have they been set? But realizing that, unless you're joining a few months in advance of the new fiscal, right, where you have a voice into what that new budget's are going to be,
Yeah.
then your services target, your services margin will have been modeled by the CFO, potentially based on what was done last year, adding X percentage and that type of thing. And then suddenly you arrive and you're like, oh yeah, you've got a quota of this. It's like, right, well, how did we get to that? Because was it based on
Yeah.
plan? Was it based on quota? Was it based on target? Was it based on forecast? Was it based on budget? Right? Because those are three different numbers in your model as well. So that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Just that realization, being self-aware that that's going to happen. And I also think that, to your point about sales and sales pipeline, I do think there's an element of being able to kind of go back to the board and say, well, look, this number here is not going to be realistic because we're at kind of 50% of that pipeline right now. But
Yeah.
the follow-up question from the board is going to be, well, what can you do to influence pipeline? And
Right.
that's the bit where PS needs to lean into sales and be like, okay, we've got less deals coming through. How can we help convert? Right? How can we
Yeah.
get involved in sales cycle to accelerate them, to build the credibility? Like you mentioned some software categories there that you've worked in, like the cutting for fashion. I love
Yeah.
those. I'm like, I love how there's all these software categories out there in all these different areas, but it's like, right, well, the services has a role to play in sales always, and
Yeah.
you're an accelerator of decisions because indecision in complex B2B selling, one of the big things is what's going to happen when I sign this order form? What's that implementation going to look like, right? And it's the confidence in that, because a lot of software is complicated and a lot of projects go wrong, right?
Yeah.
So,
And then, sales has said you were going to do this in so many weeks. And then suddenly
yep.
you start talking to the client and they don't know who's going to run the project. So it takes longer. So there's always that element. I think I want to hit on something you said there.
Mm.
Just going back to fashion technology, it was a particularly interesting team because, we had trainers that go out and train on the cutting
Yep.
solutions, which are like robotic cutting cutters, very large machines that could handle leather, any sort of fabrics. Anything we are wearing is made on one of these, likely one of the Lecter Gerber machines.
Right.
And so what was interesting about that team is there's also a software side of the business. And while I was working there, we went through, when I was at Gerber, we had a particularly interesting time. COVID hit.
Yep.
So what do we do now? And we had a number of trainers that were, as we sent out trainers to do software sit downs with designers or even go out into the cutting room and do some optimizations, we gave each of them like 5 questions to ask the people like actually on the ground, because a lot of times we're selling to executives. The salespeople are talking to a totally different group of stakeholders. And here we are, we have the design room engaged. We're asking them, what are the challenges you're facing now? What is changing? Different, really obvious questions just to get some pulse on their organization of where they're going. Are you growing in a particular area? Do you have goals for next year you can share? Things like that. Nothing really earth-shattering. All of us could come up with these questions. But once COVID hit, we had this incredibly interesting moment where a number of these companies that made dresses, jeans, a large manufacturer that did mainly like concert tour shirts, which was interesting. They were all saying the same thing. There's all these government contracts that are open and they need a high number of PPE gowns, things to cover your feet, like all
Yeah.
sorts of PPE items. And so a lot of these manufacturers were saying, hey, we have the machines. These are really basic patterns. What could we do? And so ultimately, the company was really supportive. This was an ultimate moment where I felt really proud because, it was a world
Right.
issue. And globally, we had all these clients coming to us asking us questions, and we really became a source of information for where can I get standard patterns for these items, gowns, anything you could think of. What sort of fabric do I need to procure? We did partnerships with DuPont, 3M, and we became the center of PPE manufacturing information, government approved patterns, materials, how could you construct these things
Yep.
quickly, mass, everything. And so suddenly my team was advising, a lot of this information we were preparing for free and just putting out there on a resource site. But a lot of companies said, hey, we would really like more intimate information. We're applying for this government contract. It's a revenue bridge for them, right?
Yep.
Because they're now down on orders. Nobody's going to concerts. Nobody's buying t-shirts or placing, large
Yep.
order for Springsteen shirts or something. And
Right.
so all of a sudden we were able to help them using this training service, a lot of virtual stuff, but some on site at that time too. And they were really thankful that they could bridge their revenue. We also had a new service offering. So it was very immature. I think about your maturity level that you present pretty often, and we were
Mm.
very much in the improvised period. But then
Hmm.
we got a few of them under our belt. We ultimately worked with the IFC and provided their manufacturing clients some services as well. So it was an exciting and proud moment for the company of how we could really partner with clients, but then also we weren't becoming incredibly profitable off of this service, but it helped bridge our gap back to where we were looking at plan because, of course, everything was down in the manufacturing area during COVID. It was a big struggle for everyone, particularly in
Mm.
fashion. And
Mm.
so it was an exciting time where I don't think anything like that will ever happen. And people are working, you know, 18-hour days or something just to bring these things to fruition. And hopefully we don't have to go through that again. But I think I take
Mm.
that mindset and now when I speak to my team and I'm training them and we are in this transformational period, we work on, hey, how could somebody that's engaging to a client, even from my team, so beyond sales, beyond the CS team, how can we ask them, how are they really doing? We're talking to different stakeholders. We get different information. Of course, it's important to give that information to whoever owns opportunities in that client relationship.
Mm.
But there's a lot of interesting things that you can try out and maybe have some offerings within your PS strategy that are more in that improvised stage. Well, you might be working towards world class or growth on, your more standard services, but hey, you got to improvise at times and really think about, hey, I have a person that has that skill set. We have that strategic knowledge. Why would we hold that back and not provide it to clients?
It's an amazing story. I remember you telling me about this. Spoiler alert, people, we do plan and prep for these shows. I think there's something inherently human about that. It's very how can we help? Right. That was a point in the world like where I think that mindset was something that was great about humanity. There's a lot of things I think even since then, if you think about kind of how the world's kind of crashed a little bit post post COVID in a lot of areas. At that time, there was a lot of tragedy in and around that time, and a lot of struggles for a lot of people. But there was also some of the best of humanity coming out, and stories like that are like, how can we help? How can we be helpful? And I think that's one of
Yeah,
the things the services is kind of the sharp end of the spear of that, right? And it's not, it's not necessarily thought about always in such simplistic terms, but it should be because you as you talked about, like through that, how can we be helpful, right? You're working back from that and re-engineering services go to market off of the back of it through new offerings, right? So you're seeing, through being helpful, you're finding new problems that potentially customers didn't know they have or didn't know how to solve them, as you've highlighted in the story with the
Yeah.
the cutting models, the shaping, the materials, all of that type of thing. Those were problems that people didn't know how to solve, and services had the role in that education piece. Um, and I just think that like when you've talked to me a lot about this, the difference between service provider and partnership, and like it starts with how can we be helpful, right? Because
Yeah.
if you start from we want to sell services or products, which ultimately yes is like the commercial goal, but if you start from we want to be helpful, right? There's people see that because people can see through the other stuff. These guys are just trying to sling me services or sell me
Yeah.
product. But the other piece is much more relatable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think particularly in in my current role, we have worked with a lot of technology companies, and some of them are struggling,
Mm.
just because of the macroeconomics at play. You have
Yep.
exchange rates changing, you have, economies going up and down, and things are kind of unpredictable. We all say the recession's coming, and then others say we're coming out of a recession that we didn't
Yep.
know we were in. So we find that even at Clever Bridge, where we really want to partner, and a lot of these are, you know, at cost services, or
Yep.
even sometimes packaged in for free, conversion rate optimization. So how can we help you, get more clients to your website? How can we help automate more of the customer success function? So maybe you don't need to have so many accounts on a human touch model. You actually have many of them on a self-service renewal function through campaigns and digital marketing and things. So we're really approaching clients and getting them pretty excited about the partnership around
Mm.
how can we make this better. So I think scorecarding is something that I've always been a big proponent of, going out to especially key clients and saying, hey, we've done a review of the features and functions you're using in the platform, or how
Yep.
your customers are interacting with it, whatever the scenario is at your particular technology. And how can we scorecard that to show what things could you advance on? And some clients might say, you know what, we're going through too much transformation internally. This is not the moment for us. And you have to
Yep.
respect that too.
Yep.
I would say that even to vendors that would approach me as a contract owner, sometimes this isn't the right time, but you got to come back
Yep.
in 6 months. And
Yep.
then you talk to somebody else and they say, oh, this is so, this is what we needed, because I head into the board meeting next month. We had a few levers. This is one more thing that we could do. Thanks for that strategic advisement. And I think that's where you can really, develop that partnership, as you said, because when you're just providing a standard package and it doesn't become strategic anymore, it fulfills a certain need. There's certainly a need for it in training and onboarding. You want to have things like that, but also coming back to current clients and really starting to re-engage with them on that strategic level is so important.
Mm. I think what something that I'm really into at the moment is this idea of like it's almost less offerings, less packages, less products, and much more about the architecture of services, right? So what is the overall framework that you have in terms of driving value for clients? And there's even one now that we've been working on and testing out, which is like it's almost pre-sales. So to your point about that transformation weariness or people being apprehensive about going through a transformation, because there's only so much change that you could accommodate. You talked earlier about being measured, being cautious, right? I think that's
Yeah.
something that sort of more mature or services leaders who've made the mistakes, like we all have in our respective businesses, got the war wounds and have learned from them, understand that there's only a certain amount of change both for their organization but also for clients. So something that we've been looking at is we do almost like a pre-sales engagement, because we've kind of got different markets. We've got some greenfield markets, which is where people don't have a system in the category in which we operate in. And then we've got some markets where people have an embedded solution, it's not working for them, they need to move. This would be familiar to many listeners and would apply in your different categories. And sometimes people are not sure if they want to do an evaluation of something, right? They're very
Yeah.
cagey about engaging with vendors because they don't want to be like, we might be thinking about doing something, and then you start getting a load of phone calls from lots and lots of different people. So what we've been looking at is like, how can we use services, particularly solution architecture, to do analysis pre-sales, right? To
Yeah.
basically say, look, if you do want to do something, let's do an assessment of two variables. One, business impact, which is basically what is the cost of doing nothing. So, for example, what is your operational cost if you stay working the way that you are over the next 2 years, for example, right? And also, what does it cost you over the last 18 months, right? So taking that as a total cost of inaction, if you will, which is
Yeah.
fine, which is fine. But if you're a buyer, and this will apply in your category or fashion or lots of different areas, it's fine. But then you need to know, okay, what is the cost to me of time of actually doing something? Because I've got everything else that I need to do. So do I want to really engage in that transformation? So what we've been looking at is using an architect to kind of do analysis on like how many integrations have you got, how much data is there, how many people, how many users are there, all of these different variables to give a complexity score to say, look, this project is a 2, this project is a 5, and you're going to need X amount of time to do it. Do you want in or not? Right.
Yeah.
And that's particularly actually powerful if you don't want to burn a load of money on marketing and selling to that account only for nothing to actually happen, right?
Yeah. I
Or
think,
knowing that you actually need to approach them maybe 18 months out, not 6 months out, as an example.
yeah, this is incredibly important. It's something that wasn't particularly in my department directly, but I coordinated with, I mean, certainly at Gerber and Lectra, and then at my former company in Beeline. And it was interesting because a client's never going to have those complex ROI models, and they
Mhm.
think they know what your company does and you're offering. You
Yep.
probably solve way more than what they think you do. And sometimes what I found, because I was really active in the pre-sales process and the PS sales process then, and what I realized is we could talk until we're blue in our face in the sales meetings on what we believe we're offering them and the business problems we're solving. But we weren't particularly asking them, hey, what business problems do you have? Because what ended up happening is we were using different terminology, or we were simply focusing on the newest features and functionality that just came out and what's solving there, and not what their business problem is. So having that upfront solution architect, as you call it, really figure out what challenges does this company have, qualifying the lead. Is this the right time to engage in a sales process?
Mm.
I think it's extremely valuable. I think some companies do it better than others. I would actually argue Deloitte was really good at that.
Mm.
They had whole teams that would just focus on that, doing the background analysis of digging on the internet before we even talk to them, following what PE firm or what VCO, whatever is going on at a macro level with the company, and then figuring out if it's the right moment to engage, and actually guiding them to put the RFP out rather than just receiving the RFP, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
if you can be at that level of strategic engagement, those are the projects that go the best, right? Because
Mm.
you influence the client on identifying what the challenge is. You maybe expanded that to say, hey, here's all the things that we can offer that our competitors don't. And
Mm.
then once you land the sale, I know my team can deliver on it because they're not looking for the weird and wacky item that's off the map over here where it creates some complexity in the project. So I mean, that end-to-end partnership and transition between pre-sales, sales, and professional services, client success, I think this is something that's evolving over time at different companies. It's different and certainly scales, if you're at a mid-sized company versus, 5,000 plus people, it's very formal. And sometimes I would say unflexible at companies
Yep.
that get really big. But when you can really start to shift and understand that about your clients and partner, it creates a good path for ongoing management and handing off to the client success management team too.
Mm. This commercial mindset, you've you've highlighted that that's kind of been sort of something that maybe you embraced earlier on in your career, and the environment's so important. It's such a critical component of services leadership, and I mean, how do you foster that? Like, why it's very important. So why, and also like how do you foster it both in yourself, but also kind of in your team?
It can be hard, I think. I've been in organizations that are just transforming, and maybe one department's transforming at a different pace than another, or you
Right.
don't have one of those elements along the ultimate path we just discussed. And it could be challenging. I'm probably in some of that challenge now, as any growing, like high growth technology company is. And you have people coming in with different skill sets and people that have been at the company for 10 years. And so they're maybe on a different level of the change scale, and it makes it harder to partner internally.
Hmm.
So I particularly try to find people that are really outgoing. I mean, having a sales conversation, we focus a lot. We just had a development week at Clever Bridge, and I really valued that they invested in this, and we had an external speaker talk about storytelling. And I recall some people on my team saying, "Oh, Michelle, this isn't important for me because I'm not in sales. I don't need to do this." And I hate
Yeah,
to
you
go
are.
back to like the ultimate, Alec Baldwin, like always be closing thing, but everybody is in sales. You have to talk to product and sell them that we really need this feature because all the clients are demanding it. How do you qualify that? Is it by revenue, or by how many clients are asking for it? You're selling that as part of a story. And sometimes we're also working together with sales and trying to say, okay, once professional services comes into the engagement, we don't want to be the Debbie Downers that say, okay, sales said we could do this thing in 2 weeks. It became more complex. It's now a 6-week project, but you need to tell a story on how do you sell that plan to the client.
Yep.
So both internally and externally, I think it ultimately comes to making sure your team is trained internally on all aspects of that and realizing that they're all selling something.
Yep.
I
Yep.
had one person on my team say, "Oh, well, now I'm using that with my husband at home." And I was like, great. Great. So you are all in sales. And it's really hard sometimes because, you might have a particular technology resource that just wants to be behind the scenes, not talk to clients. But it's also good to nurture those resources as well because they're all part of the team.
Yeah, yeah. I'm talking to my husband about our burn down rate. How much she's pissing me off. That'd be a good one, wouldn't it? I
Yeah.
think there's certain there's certain ways to do it where you have some people will respond to like we need to, Deloitte's a great example of they were very good at job. They do a very good job of marketing the project after they've sold the project. They understand the importance of that because of the amount of new
Yeah.
stakeholders that come in. So, if you look at the quality of kind of how they architect that story in each and every meeting, it's really important. I think that my advice to services leads, either new ones or old, or very experienced heads, is you also have to tailor that story internally. Like certain groups are going to respond to, like, we need to have some commercial acumen team, or we need to have some customer acumen, right?
Yeah.
Particularly if you're giving away services. To your point earlier, it's like, what are we finding with our projects? Well, nobody's showing up for meetings. Okay, why do we think that is? Oh, they're not taking it seriously. Okay, why aren't they taking it seriously? Well, because we're not charging them. Okay, why aren't we charging them? Right? And you start to get down to something that is commercial. And so,
Yeah.
therefore, to circumvent that or to offset that, we're going to need to have some commercial acumen about how we communicate why this is important to them, right? And that continues to happen through a project. I also think that, to your point on storytelling, um, and you mentioned it earlier about the importance of language, right? That's not coached enough in services in general, right? Like there's a lot of work around like process and handovers, and that's a great example, like handovers and things like that. It's like, but we need to get a lot better at like, okay, we're trying to drive these mystical outcomes for clients. Okay, what is that? Right?
Yeah.
Like I'm always like, that's the change that the client, and you would use the word client, so you can tell you're from a consulting background, not from a SaaS background originally, because everyone else is customer. But I'm the same. I'm consulting background originally. So like the client talks about this problem in a certain way. What words do they use? Right? Do they talk about do they talk about margin, or do they talk about contribution? Right?
Yeah.
As an example, are they talking about, like, I've seen people selling deals where it was like it was sold revenue, right, not booked revenue, right? So what is the language that they use, and how do we simply and quickly articulate what do they want to achieve? And this comes back to the commercial mindset piece, because you have to be able to talk in the language of the client very simply, right? Because that's how you get heard, right? If you've
Yeah.
got all of this waffle that's not in their language, people disengage. What are you doing? So when you've looked to develop that customer acumen and that stakeholder engagement, in your teams, what have you done to do that?
Yeah, it's interesting. We did what first comes to my mind, and we didn't talk about this before, but we did an exercise at one of my prior companies where there's a Japanese way of presenting,
Okay.
and you can have a maximum of one picture and three words on a slide, and you have to
Okay.
tell your story. And I forget the term for it, but we had an external trainer come in, and my team was incredibly frustrated. And I said, you need to sell me something. And everybody picked something off their desk, and they had to sell it to me with, or the team with this presentation style. And I think what it picked up on is a lot of them, even though they didn't know it, even though they were selling me a coffee cup, they're saying, Michelle, we know you drink coffee every day. So they could speak to it, but it wasn't a lot of words and slides and things. And
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, they were teaching me that I wanted to buy the item, but also how I would sell that too, because they were speaking more of my language and they learned about me. And going back to your solution focused architect and pre-sales, I think
Yep.
that's what you get, right? You learn all those words and you learn to teach your stakeholders and your champion of how to sell what you want to their leadership.
Mm.
And it's super important. And I mean, just relating it back to professional services and my team I was speaking of, I saw them using not this presentation model with clients and the Japanese, pictures and things, but it was just a nice challenge to have them simplify things. I see so many slides that will take sometimes at any company from client to client in a sales process, your first call deck, right? And
Yep.
maybe it's not changed from client to client, and I think having that knowledge up front and the qualification helps you tailor that and really speak in their language, looking up their principles and their company mission online and relating that back, reading their most recent quarterly reports, or, anything you can dig up online, I think is incredibly valuable. So especially when I've had teams that were focused on professional services sales,
Yep.
that I would have them read up on all of that. And if the sales lead didn't post it in Salesforce or whatnot, we're going to dig around and try to find, go on LinkedIn, who's their leader of professional services, who's the buyer
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be together working with us. Is it the CTO or whoever you're selling to? Look
Mm-hmm.
around on their profile. What are they interested in? What are they posting about? Are they really focused on AI right now?
Mm-hmm.
This is such a
Yep.
hot topic. If somebody's really getting out there and being a proponent of AI, maybe you want to focus on that a little bit more in your offer and say we can train you on that. And, you know, going back to my prior companies, we certainly had more resources to focus on that. I think as you might bounce around to different scaling organizations, you simply don't have the time. So you're strapped from a bandwidth perspective to do all of that. But I mean, in an ideal world, it's so important.
Mm. I like the four lenses of tailoring. So this is a simple one for folks if you're looking to develop your prep skills and your customer acumen skills. It's the four lenses, which are basically industry, company, function, person. So if you're struggling to find that hook with your clients, you look at what's going on in their industry. For example, are they heavily regulated? Is there lots of M&A in their industry? What's going on in the company? Have they just raised? Have they done a RIF? Are they in a highly competitive market? What's going on in the function? As you say, is it transforming? Is it not? And then the individual. Pechakucha, I think, is the Japanese presentation style, maybe.
Oh, there you go.
But there we go. Listen, thank you ever so much for coming on. I think a lot of great learnings. I think one of the things that you've kind of articulated really well is like the sands can shift beneath your feet, which is a phrase I've used quite a lot, both in the Services Delivery Alliance and on this show before, which is kind of like this, you know, you need to be aware of kind of the environment that you're in and how that's changing around you, right? Like you say, can be something as simple as, is the pipeline this month going to mean that as a services organization in 3 months' time, I'm going to be deep in the hole, as an
Yeah.
example, but also like really being on top of like, what are the targets? Why are they the targets? How have they been set? I think that was really important. And I just also like the, you know, the be interested, be in, that's kind of like something in your mindset, which is like, be really interested in the industry that you're in and be
Yeah.
helpful. Try and push that industry forwards and it pays you back, right? You get good stuff coming out of that. And PS is a unique position to do that because you're talking to clients and there's a perception of the function and the person that's very different to a CSM, a salesperson. You know, so I really appreciate it. Did you enjoy it?
Loved it. This was great, Jonathan. Thanks for having me. This is the most relaxing part of my day this morning. So it's just
That's
about
what
8
everyone
o'clock here.
says.
I'll have my coffee now.
Good, good. Thanks, Michelle. Take care.
All right. Thank you.